Hello, everyone. I'm sorry if there's going to be a little bit of background noise, but I'm out here at the park and there's a bunch of kids playing off in the distance. But this video is going to be about the race in prison. Um, it's just part of American history, and sometimes the history is overlooked whenever we see something currently happening. And this will explain a lot of that. So, in September of 2016, on the 45th anniversary of the infamous Attica prison uprising, tens of thousands of U.S. inmates launched a nationwide protest. The inmates' grievances were as varied as the states they came from: pennies for labor in South Carolina, racial discrimination in California, and excessive force in Michigan, just as a couple of examples. The thing that they shared in common, though, was their goal, and that was to end legalized slavery inside of the American correctional facilities. In 1970, the era of mass incarceration began. The growth in the nation's prisons population was deliberate policy. It was inflamed by campaign rhetoric that focused on an uptick in crime and orchestrated by people in power, including legislators who demanded stricter sentencing laws, states and local executives who ordered law enforcement officers to be tougher on crime, and prison administrators who were forced to house a growing population with limited resources available to them. Although the unprecedented increase in prison populations during this period may seem like an aberration, the ground was fertile for this growth long before 1970. Certainly, the number of people sent to prison was far greater during the era of mass incarceration than in other time periods, but the policies that fueled that growth stemmed from the familiar narrative, one involving public anxiety about both actual and alleged criminal behavior by racial and ethnic minorities, and the use of state punishment to control them. It is a narrative that repeats itself throughout this counting's history, or throughout this country's history. From America's founding to the present, there are stories of crime waves and criminal behavior, and then patterns of disproportionate imprisonment of those on the margins of society: African Americans, Native Americans, immigrants, refugees, and others with outsider status. The result has been the persistent and disproportionate impact of incarcerations on those groups. From 1850 to 1940, racial and ethnic minorities, including foreign born and non English speaking European immigrants, made up 40 to 50% of the prison population. In 2015, about 55% of people imprisoned in federal or state prisons were Black or Latino. It is a narrative founded on myths, lies, and stereotypes about people of color. And to truly reform prisons' practices, it is a narrative that must be reckoned with and subverted. We must grapple with the ways in which prisons in this country are entwined with the legacy of slavery and generations of racial and social injustices. No new era is built from a clean slate, but rather each is layered on top of earlier practices, values, and physical infrastructure. Mass incarcerations is an era marked by significant encroachment on the freedoms of racial and ethnic minorities, most notably African Americans. But this inequitable treatment has its roots in the correctional eras that came before it, which each one building on the last and leading to the prison landscape we face today. The year 1865 should be as notable to criminologists as the year 1970. While it marked the end of the Civil War and the passage of the 13th Amendment, it also triggered the nation's first prison boom when the number of African Americans arrested and incarcerated surged. This was the result of state governments reaching to two powerful social forces. First, public anxiety and the fear about crime stemming from newly freed African Americans, and the second, economic depression resulting from the war and the loss of the free supply of labor. State and local leaders in the South used the criminal justice system to both pacify the public sphere and bolster the depressed country's economy. All across the South, black codes were passed. That's also going to be a video that I will be doing. But these codes were passed that outlawed behaviors common to African Americans, such as walking without a purpose, or walking at night, hunting on Sundays, or settling on public or private lands. These laws also stripped formerly incarcerated people of their citizenship rights long after their sentences were completed. Among the most well-known examples are laws that temporarily or permanently suspend the right to vote of people convicted of felonies. Southern law enforcement authorities targeted African American people and aggressively enforced these laws, and they funneled greater numbers of them into the state punishment systems. By the 1870s, almost all of the people under criminal custody of the southern states, a full 95%, were African American. State penal authorities deployed these imprisoned people to help build the South. They rented out convicted people to private companies through a system of convict leasing and put incarcerated individuals to work on, for example, prison farms to produce agricultural products. In the Reconstruction South, these were fiscally attractive strategies given the destruction of Southern prisons during the Civil War and the economic depression that followed it. Convict leasing programs that operated through an external supervision model in which incarcerated people were supervised entirely by a private company that was paying the state for their labor, turned to state costs instead of a much needed profit, and enable states to take penal custody of people without the need to build prisons in which to house them. Although economic, political, and industrial changes in the United States contributed to the end of private convict leasing and practice, by 1928, other forms of slavery like labor practices emerged. State prison authorities introduced the chain gang, a brutal form of forced labor in which incarcerated people toiled on public works such as building roads or clearing land. Chain gangs existed into the 1940s, and as with convict leasing before it, those sentenced to serve on chain gangs were predominantly African Americans. Prison farms also continued to dominate the South landscape during the period. In 1928, Texas was operating 12 state prison farms, and nearly 100% of the workers on them were African Americans. The loophole contained within the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery and indentured servitude, except as punishment for a crime, paved the way for Southern states to use convict leasing, prison farms, and chain gangs as legal means to continue white control over black people and to secure their labor at no or little cost. Very few white men and women were ever sent to work under these arrangements. By assigning black people to work in the fields and on government works, the state-sanctioned punishment of black people was visible to the public, while white punishment was obscured behind prison walls. By many accounts, conditions under the convict leasing system were harsher than they had been under slavery. as these private companies no longer had an ownership interest in the longevity of their laborers who could be easily replaced at low cost by the state. Although the incarcerated people subjected to this treatment sought redress from the courts, they found little relief. Time and again, the courts approved of this abusive use of convict labor, confirming the Virginia Supreme Court declaration in 1871 that an incarcerated person was in effect a slave of the state. The first half of the 20th century saw an expansion of prison populations in the northern states, which coincided with shifting ideas about race and ethnicity. An influx of Black Americans to urban regions in the North, and increased competition over limited jobs in northern cities between newly arrived Black Americans and European immigrants as a backdrop to these changing demographics. Public anxiety about crime flourished. A brief spike in relevant crimes in the 1920s was met with incendiary media coverage, highly publicized federal interventions into local crime, and branding of certain suspected criminals as public enemies, stoking public fear and supporting criminal stereotypes. The growing fear of crime, often directed at Black Americans, intensified policing practices across the country and inspired the passage of a spate of mandatory sentencing policies, both of which contributed to a surge in incarceration. Between 1926 and 1940, state prison populations across the country increased by 67%. Between 1910 and 1970, over 6 million Black Americans migrated from the South to North urban centers known as the Great Migration. This movement of people dramatically transformed the makeup of both the South and the North. In 1910, 90% of Black Americans lived in the South, but by 1970, that number had dropped to 53%. These migrants, typically more financially stable Black Americans, were fleeing racial terror and economic exclusion. This influx of people overlapped with the waves of immigrants from southern to eastern Europe who continued to disembark and settle across the country throughout the first half of the 20th century. During this time, the dominant white class connected criminality to three distinct groups: lower class whites, immigrants, and Black Americans. However, while white and immigrant criminality was believed by social reformers to arise from social conditions that could be ameliorated through civic institutions such as schools and prisons, Black criminality was given a different explanation. Widely popular, but since discredited, theories of racial inferiority that were supported by newly developed quote unquote scientific categorization schemes took hold, combined with the popular portrayal of Black men as menacing criminals, as represented in the film The Birth of a Nation in 1915. A sharper distinction between white and Black Americans emerged, which also contributed to a compression of European ethnic identities such as Irish, Italian, and Polish into a larger white or Caucasian ethnic category. These shifting beliefs regarding race and crime had serious implications for Black Americans. In the first half of the 20th century, racial disparities in prison populations roughly doubled in the northern states most affected by the Great Migration. These beliefs also impacted the conditions that Black and white people experienced once behind bars, as in the South. Putting incarcerated people to work was a central focus for most northern prison systems. Until the 1930s, the industrial prison, a system in which incarcerated people were forced to work for private or state industry or public works, was the prevalent prison model. Toil, pain, and hardships became a primary aspect of punishment, while administrators grew increasingly concerned about profits. The rise of organized labor in the 1920s and 1930s, as well as the passage of federal legislation restricting the interstate commerce of goods made by convict laborers, brought on an end to many industrial-style prisons. In their place, the conditions and activities that made up the incarceration experience remained similar, but with purposeless and economically valueless activities like rock breaking, replacing factory labor. By the mid 1900s, as white immigrant groups were absorbed into the white racial category, the white public became increasingly concerned about the conditions they endured in prisons. Starting in about 1940, a new era of prison reform emerged. Some of the rigidity of earlier prison structures was relaxed, and some aspects of incarceration became more physically and psychologically tolerable. Under this new correctional institution model, prisons were still meant to inflict a measure of pain on those inside their walls, but the degree was marginally reduced in comparison to earlier periods. These prisons offered more recreation, visitation, and communication with the outside world through regular access to the mail, as well as sporadic movies and concerts. Most notably, these periods saw the first introduction of therapeutic programming and educational and vocational training in a prison setting. These programs were largely justified on the principle that they could bring about the rehabilitation of an incarcerated person, but they weren't intended to rehabilitate everyone in prison. They were reserved for people deemed capable of reform by, yep, you guessed it, white people. Incarcerated black Americans and other racial ethnic minorities also lived in race segregated housing units, and their exclusion from prison social life could be glimpsed only in their invisibility. Their experiences were largely unexamined, and many early sociological studies of prisons do not include incarcerated people of color at all. Beginning in the 1960s, a law and order rhetoric with social undertones emerged in politics, which ultimately ushered in the era of mass incarcerations and flipped the racial composition of prisons in the United States from majority white at mid century to majority black in the 1990s. As in previous periods, the criminal justice system was used to marginalize and penalize people of color. In the 1960s and 70s, as riots broke out in a number of urban centers and a wave of violent crime rolled across the United States, politicians on both sides of the aisle not only continued to link race and crime in rhetoric, they took action enacting harsh, punitive, and retributively oriented politics as a solution to rising crime rates. As Black Americans achieved some measure of social and political freedom through the civil rights movement, politicians took steps to curb those gains. In 1969, I think, maybe 1964, presidential election, Barry Goldwater, Lyndon Johnson's unsuccessful Republican challenger, campaigned on a platform that explicitly connected street crime with civil rights activism. In 1965, President Johnson declared the war on crime and perceived increases in crime in urban centers, which were largely populated by African Americans, became connected with race in the public's consciousness. Richard Nixon also successfully used a street crime and civil rights activism narrative in his 1968 and 1972 presidential campaigns. The message resonated with many Southern whites and Northern working class whites who left the Democratic Party in the decades that followed. This tight link between race and crime was later termed the Southern Strategy. Compounding the persistent myth of black criminality was a national recession in the 1970s that led to a loss of jobs for low-skilled men in urban centers, hitting black men the hardest. The departure of white and middle to upper class black Americans from cities to the suburbs further concentrated poor black people in the handful of city blocks. Many black Americans found themselves trapped in decaying urban core with few municipal services or legitimate opportunities for employment. The quality of life in cities declined under these conditions of social disorganization and disinvestment, and drug and other illicit markets took hold. In the 1980s and 90s, policymakers continued to turn to punitive policing and sentencing strategies to restore social order and address increasing drug use, resulting in large and larger numbers of unemployment black urban residents with low levels of education being swept into prisons. The numbers are stunning. In 1970, the state and federal prison population was 196,441. By 1985, it had grown to 481,616. By the year 2008, federal and state correctional authorities had jurisdiction over 1.6 million people. These numbers have defined the current period of mass incarceration, prisons overflowed, and services and amenities for incarcerated people diminished. People in prison protested. The violent riots erupted, such as the uprising at the Attica Correctional Facility in 1971. Legal remedies for people in prison also dried up as incarcerated people lost access to the courts to contest the conditions of their incarceration. This growth in incarceration disproportionately impacted Black Americans. In 2008, Black men were imprisoned at a rate of 6.5 times higher than white men. The incarceration boom fundamentally altered the transition to adulthood for several generations of Black men, and to a lesser but still significant extent, Black women and Latino men and women. By the turn of the 21st century, Black men born in 1960s were more likely to have gone to prison than to have completed college or military services. That is a lot to think about. But that is the history of how we got to where we are today with our prison systems. And I think a change is long overdue. Have a good day, everybody.